Buildings are meant to stand, to shelter, to protect. But sometimes what is supposed to offer safety becomes the very thing that traps those inside. A structure collapses in seconds, but the decisions that led to it were made long before the first crack appeared. This is not just the story of a building that failed. It's the story of greed hidden beneath cement, of warnings ignored, and of a disaster that could have been prevented. Beneath the wreckage lies more than broken concrete. There are secrets buried in every fallen beam. Welcome. Over the next hour, the truth behind this catastrophe will be revealed. How corruption built the foundation for tragedy and how lives were lost, not by accident, but by design. This is what happens when safety is sold for profit. It was meant to be a symbol of progress, an architectural marvel that would redefine the skyline. A high-rise structure, gleaming under the morning sun, promising prosperity and modernity. Workers moved with precision, residents settled in, and businesses prepared for a new beginning. But in a single catastrophic moment, everything changed. Without warning, a deafening roar shattered the morning calm. Concrete groaned under immense strain, glass exploded outward like shrapnel, and steel beams twisted as if they were nothing more than threadbare wires. The ground trembled. A thunderous crash echoed across the city as thousands of tons of material plummeted into a heap of unrecognizable wreckage. Within seconds, dust and debris swallowed the sky, and an entire section of the city stood frozen in disbelief. What had been a towering structure just moments ago was now a ruin. Rescue teams rushed to the scene, their footsteps muffled by layers of dust. Sirens wailed, their echoes bouncing off the skeletal remains of what should have been a masterpiece. As the hours passed, the true extent of the catastrophe began to emerge. Families waited in agony, desperate for news. The air was thick with a sense of urgency, but buried beneath the chaos was an unspoken question. How could this happen? At first, explanations were scarce. Perhaps an unforeseen structural flaw? A rare and unfortunate accident? But as experts combed through the ruins, analyzing every fractured column and warped beam, the narrative began to shift. This was no mere miscalculation. This was no stroke of bad luck. The truth, it seemed, lay not in what the eye could see, but in what had been hidden all along. Beneath the surface, evidence pointed toward something far more unsettling. An intricate web of deception, unchecked ambition, and decisions made in boardrooms that sealed the fate of those who had no say. What should have been built to last had been compromised from the very beginning. The materials, the foundation of it all, had been tampered with. The cost of greed, once concealed in ledgers and contracts, had now revealed itself in the most devastating way possible. This is not just the story of a structure that gave way under its own weight. It is a tale of betrayal in its most devastating form, of misplaced trust, and of a hidden truth that, once uncovered, sent shockwaves through an entire industry. The deeper we go, the clearer it becomes. This was not just a failure of engineering, but a collapse of integrity itself. And at the center of it all, a man whose influence stretched far beyond the construction site. A man whose name was etched into contracts, bank records, and backroom deals. A man whose choices turned a vision of prosperity into a nightmare. But justice has a way of catching up, even with those who believe themselves untouchable. This is the story of a structure that fell not by accident but by design. A story of unchecked power, recklessness, and the undeniable truth that when greed lays the foundation, collapse is inevitable. The sun had barely risen when the city stirred to life. Streets buzzed with movement, workers rushing to their jobs, shopkeepers unlocking doors, and children heading off to school. The building, standing tall in the heart of the business district, was a new landmark. People admired its sleek design, a sign of development in an ever-growing metropolis. Offices were filling up, workers settling into their daily routines, and in the lower floors, businesses prepared to open for the day. Then, without warning, the ground trembled. A deep, low rumble rolled through the air, followed by a loud cracking sound. People looked up, confused at first. But within seconds, confusion turned into fear. Windows shattered. Walls buckled. The once sturdy structure began to tilt ever so slightly, Then all at once, a loud snap tore through the air as concrete split apart. Thick dust erupted from the building's base. The upper floors caved in, collapsing onto those below, one after another, like a house of cards. The force was unstoppable. Steel beams twisted, breaking free from their joints, groaning under pressure before crashing down. A cloud of dust engulfed the streets, swallowing everything in its path. The deafening noise echoed for miles, drowning out the shouts of those running for safety. In the chaos, people sprinted in every direction, covering their faces, trying to escape the falling debris. Some froze in place, unable to move, unable to believe what they were seeing. A few had been inside just moments before and now stood outside, covered in dust, staring at the gaping void where the building had stood. The street, once full of life, had become a disaster zone. Rubble stretched across the road. Cars were crushed under fallen concrete. Streetlights bent under the weight of broken metal. The air was thick, not just with dust but with the eerie silence that followed the collapse. A silence soon broken by sirens, shouts, and the desperate cries of those searching for their loved ones. In the minutes after the collapse, dust filled the air, making it hard to see, hard to breathe. Those who had escaped stood frozen, their clothes covered in gray powder, their faces streaked with sweat and shock. Some coughed, trying to clear their lungs. Others whispered prayers, unable to believe what had just happened. A man in a torn office shirt clutched his arm, blood trickling down from a cut on his forehead. His voice shook as he spoke. "I was on the 4th floor when I felt everything move. First, I thought it was an earthquake. Then the walls cracked, and the ceiling started falling. I ran. I didn't even grab my things. Just ran." Nearby, a woman sat on the curb, trembling. I heard screams from inside, people yelling for help. But there was nothing anyone could do. Everything was crashing down. Her hands, still shaking, held onto her phone. Its screen shattered from the fall. Emergency workers rushed past, searching the wreckage. A firefighter pulled a young man from the rubble, his clothes torn and covered in dust. He gasped for air, barely able to speak. "I was in the stairwell. I don't know how I made it out. Everything just disappeared." Further down the street, an older man gripped the hands of his daughter, who had managed to escape. His voice was thick with emotion. "She was inside. She was on the top floor. I don't know how she got out, but she's here. She's here." His relief was overwhelming, but his eyes kept drifting back toward the ruins, knowing many others were still trapped. Rescue workers moved fast, listening for sounds beneath the rubble. Every now and then, a faint voice could be heard. Some called out for help. Others could only groan. Each sound meant someone was still alive, waiting to be found. Hope flickered with each rescue, but alongside it, dread settled in. Not everyone would make it out. Emergency crews worked through the dust and debris, their movements swift but careful. Each second counted. The sound of sirens filled the air, growing louder as more ambulances, fire trucks, and police vehicles arrived. The once busy street was now an emergency zone, lined with stretchers, medical teams, and anxious bystanders. The damage was overwhelming. What had been a towering structure was now a heap of broken concrete and twisted steel. The surrounding buildings had not been spared. Some had cracked walls, shattered windows, and fallen debris littering their entrances. Power lines dangled dangerously, swaying in the wind. The air was thick with smoke and dust, making it difficult to see more than a few feet ahead. A rescue worker shouted for silence. The team listened closely. Faint tapping came from beneath a large slab of concrete. Someone was alive under the rubble. The crew moved fast, calling for more hands. With each piece they removed, the tapping grew weaker. Minutes felt like hours, but finally, a hand emerged from the dust. A man, barely conscious, was pulled free. His breathing was shallow, but he was alive. Not everyone was as fortunate. Rows of covered bodies lined the pavement, placed there by teams who had run out of space. Volunteers handed out water to those who had been rescued, their faces etched with exhaustion and sorrow. Some people searched through the crowd, hoping to find familiar faces. Others stood in silence, staring at the ruins, unable to process what had just happened. Officials arrived, taking notes, speaking in hushed tones. Some pointed at the remains of the structure, shaking their heads. Engineers studied the wreckage, already suspecting what might have caused the failure. But for now, there was only one priority: finding those who were still buried beneath the ruins. The hours stretched on. Rescue teams refused to slow down. For those trapped, hope was all they had left. News of the disaster spread quickly. Within hours, reporters arrived at the scene, their cameras capturing the wreckage, the rescue efforts, and the stunned faces of those who had lost everything. Headlines filled television screens and social media feeds. Across the country, people watched in disbelief. Anger rose among the crowd gathered near the ruins. Some shouted at officials, demanding answers. Others wept, still searching for missing loved ones. Community leaders called for action, questioning how a structure that had stood for only a short time could collapse so completely. Theories began to surface. Some believed an earthquake had caused the destruction, though no tremors had been recorded. Others speculated about an explosion or a sudden engineering failure. But as more details emerged, a troubling possibility gained traction. Something had gone wrong long before the building ever fell. Journalists uncovered reports from former workers who claimed that problems had been ignored during construction. One worker who had helped pour the concrete spoke anonymously. "We knew something wasn't right. The materials didn't seem strong enough, but nobody listened. We were told to keep working." More voices came forward, each adding to a growing suspicion. This was not an accident. It was a disaster waiting to happen. Engineers and safety inspectors arrived at the site, carefully examining the remains of the structure. Each broken beam, each fractured slab of concrete, told a story. The way the building had fallen was unnatural. Instead of standing for decades, it had crumbled in seconds, as though its foundation had never been strong enough to hold its weight. Structural experts studied the wreckage closely. The steel reinforcement inside the concrete columns was thin, far below the required standard. Some of the beams had snapped in ways that suggested the metal had been weak from the start. A civil engineer, speaking to reporters, explained, "Buildings are designed to distribute weight evenly. When they fail this quickly, it often means something was compromised, either in the materials, the design, or the construction process itself." Investigators took samples from the debris for testing. Early results confirmed what many feared: the concrete mix was substandard. It lacked the necessary strength to support a structure of that size. Instead of using high-quality materials, cheaper alternatives had been used, ones that crumbled under pressure. A retired architect reviewing early findings was blunt in his assessment. This wasn't an engineering mistake. This was negligence. Someone cut corners, and now people are paying the price. The search for answers was just beginning, but already the evidence pointed toward a single conclusion: this disaster could have been prevented. Officials held a press conference just hours after the collapse. Standing before flashing cameras and microphones, a government spokesperson addressed the nation. "Our hearts go out to those affected by this terrible event. We are doing everything in our power to support rescue efforts and provide aid to the survivors." Promises were made. Investigations would be launched. Those responsible would be held accountable. But for many, words were not enough. Public trust had already begun to erode. Authorities ordered an immediate safety review of other buildings developed by the same company. Inspectors visited sites across the city, looking for signs of similar risks. Meanwhile, police launched an inquiry into the construction firm behind the collapsed building. Documents were seized, and key figures were questioned. Behind the scenes, pressure mounted. Reports surfaced that previous complaints about the building's safety had been ignored. A whistleblower from the city's planning office revealed that permits had been rushed through despite concerns. "There were red flags," he admitted, speaking anonymously. But powerful people wanted this project finished fast. Too fast. Survivors and families of those lost demanded action. Protests erupted outside government offices, with people holding signs that read, justice for the fallen, and no more corrupt buildings. The collapse was no longer just a tragedy. It had become a symbol of something bigger, the cost of greed, the failure of oversight, and a system that had allowed danger to be built, brick by brick. The company behind the collapsed building was no small player in the industry. It had been involved in several major projects, boasting sleek office towers, shopping centers, and residential complexes. On the surface, it appeared to be a trusted name in urban development, but those who had worked closely with the firm knew otherwise. Its founder and CEO had built a reputation as a bold businessman, someone who moved fast and made things happen. He was often seen at industry events, shaking hands with officials and developers. His company had secured government contracts, completed projects ahead of schedule, and expanded rapidly in just a few years. To the public, he was a self-made success. To those who worked under him, the reality was more complicated. Former employees described a culture of pressure. Deadlines were tight, costs were slashed wherever possible, and anyone who questioned decisions risked being replaced. Safety concerns were brushed aside if they threatened the bottom line. Some contractors had even walked away from projects, unwilling to compromise their standards, but many others stayed silent, unwilling to risk their careers. The company's financial records painted an even more troubling picture. Contracts were won at unusually low bids, raising questions about how quality could be maintained. Some projects had faced complaints of structural defects, though these were dismissed as minor issues. Lawsuits had been quietly settled. The collapse had exposed what many had long suspected. This was not a company built on quality. It was built on cost-cutting, rushed work, and a leader who prioritized profit over everything else. While the official investigation was underway, information began to surface from those who had worked behind the scenes. Engineers, former employees, and subcontractors came forward, revealing troubling details about the way the building had been constructed. One former site supervisor admitted that workers had been pressured to use cheaper materials. "We were told to make adjustments, less cement in the concrete mix, thinner steel bars, fewer safety checks. If we raised concerns, we were ignored." Another contractor recalled how inspections were rushed or, in some cases, skipped altogether. "We knew there were problems, but the company didn't want delays. They just wanted the job finished." Documents leaked to the press showed discrepancies in supply orders. The materials listed in official reports did not match what was actually used. High-quality steel and cement had been ordered on paper, but site workers confirmed that inferior substitutes had arrived instead. Someone had pocketed the difference. Financial records raised further suspicion. Large sums of money had moved through company accounts, disappearing into untraceable transactions. A construction accountant, speaking under anonymity, revealed the numbers never made sense. Budgets were cut, but the savings weren't reflected in the final costs. The money went somewhere else. As more insiders spoke out, a pattern emerged. This was not just about negligence. Corners had been cut intentionally, and someone had profited while lives were put at risk. Investigators turned their attention to the company's financial records. A team of auditors combed through bank transactions, contract agreements, and supplier invoices. What they found confirmed the worst suspicions. Money had been siphoned away, leaving the project dangerously underfunded. Payments meant for high-quality materials had been redirected. Suppliers had been pressured to provide cheaper alternatives while invoices continued to reflect premium prices. One forensic accountant explained, "On paper, everything looked fine, but in reality, millions were missing, and the construction site never saw the materials that were actually paid for." Authorities traced the missing funds to offshore accounts, shell companies, and private investments. Some of the money had been funneled into luxury properties, expensive cars, and high-end lifestyles for executives at the company. Meanwhile, workers at the site had been left with substandard materials and unsafe conditions. Emails recovered from company servers showed internal warnings that had been ignored. In one message, a project manager voiced concerns about the concrete mix, stating it did not meet industry standards. The response was brief: "Stick to the schedule. We can't afford delays." Bribes had also played a role. Officials responsible for approving safety checks had been paid off to look the other way. In some cases, inspections had been signed off without anyone ever setting foot on the site. The deeper the investigation went, the clearer it became. This disaster was no accident. It was the result of deliberate choices driven by greed. The evidence was undeniable. Engineers had warned about weak materials. Workers had questioned rushed deadlines. Financial experts had uncovered missing funds. Yet, the project had continued without hesitation. Now, with the building reduced to rubble, the full picture was finally coming into focus. Investigators pieced together the chain of events that had led to the collapse. It started with a company determined to cut costs at any expense. The concrete mix had been diluted to save money. Steel reinforcements had been reduced, making the structure fragile. Inspections had been bypassed through bribery, ensuring that no one would raise alarms. A civil engineer involved in the inquiry broke down the failure in simple terms. The weight of the building was too much for its own support system. It wasn't built to last, it was built to save money. Structural diagrams confirmed this. The foundation was weak, the load-bearing columns too thin, and the upper floors had added stress the building could not handle. The corruption extended beyond just one company. Government officials who had signed off on approvals were now under scrutiny. Who had turned a blind eye? Who had ignored safety reports? The collapse had not only revealed corporate greed but also the cracks within an entire system meant to protect the public. What should have been a long-standing structure had instead become a symbol of greed and negligence. Now, with the truth coming to light, the question remained, would those responsible face real consequences? The investigation reached its turning point when authorities issued arrest warrants for key figures linked to the collapsed building. The CEO of the construction company, high-ranking executives, and several government officials faced serious legal charges. Law enforcement moved quickly, taking some into custody while others attempted to flee. One executive was caught at an airport, carrying large sums of cash. Another was found hiding in a private residence, refusing to speak to the press. Their confident public images had crumbled under the weight of the evidence. Court proceedings began with a packed courtroom and intense media coverage. Prosecutors laid out a detailed case, showing how cost-cutting, bribery, and fraudulent approvals had led to the disaster. Testimonies from former employees, engineers, and forensic experts painted a damning picture of how greed had put lives at risk. The CEO, once a respected businessman, now stood at the center of the trial. His defense claimed he had no knowledge of the faulty materials or illegal transactions, but emails and financial records told a different story. One investigator stated, "The orders came from the top. This wasn't just bad luck. It was a choice." The case stretched on for months, with each hearing revealing more about how deep the corruption had gone. Would the court deliver justice? Or would the powerful find a way to escape accountability? The public watched closely, refusing to let the tragedy be forgotten. For those who had lost loved ones, a courtroom conviction would never be enough. No sentence could undo the pain or bring back the lives that had been lost. Families gathered outside the courthouse each day, holding photographs of the people they had once embraced. Their voices demanded more than just arrests. They wanted accountability that would prevent such a tragedy from ever happening again. Lawsuits against the construction company piled up. Relatives of those affected joined forces with legal teams to seek financial compensation. Survivors who had escaped the collapse with injuries faced mounting medical bills, and many had lost their homes in the disaster. Their legal battle was not just about money. It was about exposing the failure of a system that had allowed this to happen. Protests erupted in front of government offices and city halls. People carried signs reading "No more corrupt buildings and justice for the fallen." The anger was no longer just about one collapsed structure. It was about the realization that this could happen again if real change didn't take place. A mother whose son had died in the collapse spoke in front of cameras, her voice steady but full of grief. They built a trap instead of a home. They stole lives to fill their pockets. And now they must pay for it. The legal battle was long and exhausting, but families refused to back down. They weren't just seeking justice for themselves. They were fighting to ensure no one else would suffer the same fate. The collapse had sent shockwaves through the country, but it wasn't just a single incident. It was a symptom of a deeper problem. In the aftermath, government officials scrambled to respond. Public pressure forced lawmakers to take action, and new building safety regulations were introduced. Inspections on ongoing projects were tightened, and loopholes that had allowed bribery and shortcuts were supposedly closed. However, skepticism remained. Would these changes be enforced, or were they just promises to calm public outrage? Investigative journalists uncovered more cases of weak oversight in past projects, proving that this disaster was not an isolated event. The case also set a legal precedent. The construction company was not only sued for damages but also banned from future projects. Company executives, once seen as untouchable, were facing lengthy prison sentences. Several government officials who had approved faulty permits were removed from office, and some faced legal action themselves. The scandal forced industries beyond construction to reevaluate their practices. Other sectors began auditing their processes, fearing similar exposure. A nationwide discussion emerged about corruption in business and government, with citizens demanding transparency. But despite the new laws and promises, one question lingered. Was this the moment real change began? Or would history repeat itself when the public's attention moved elsewhere? The once powerful construction company had collapsed, not in the physical sense, but in every other way. Its name, once associated with major projects, was now linked to tragedy and scandal. The government revoked its license, banning it from bidding on future contracts. Investors pulled out, leaving the company in financial ruin. Employees who had been unaware of the corruption suddenly found themselves without jobs. The company's CEO, once a respected businessman, was now a convicted criminal. After months of legal battles, the court found him guilty of fraud, negligence, and bribery. His sentencing was met with mixed reactions. Some believed his prison term was too short for the lives lost, while others saw it as a rare victory against corporate crime. Other top executives also faced consequences. Some received prison sentences, while others fled the country before they could be arrested. A few managed to avoid jail time by cooperating with investigators, exposing more layers of corruption in exchange for lighter punishments. Despite these convictions, rumors spread that some of the key figures were still living in luxury, using hidden assets and offshore accounts to maintain their wealth. The legal battle had ended, but for many, justice still felt incomplete. For those who had lost loved ones or survived the collapse, the pain did not end with the trial. Many were still struggling to rebuild their lives. Some had lost their homes, their jobs, or their health. Medical bills continued to pile up for those who had been injured. Psychological scars remained, with survivors reliving the horror of that day in their minds. Families who had fought for justice now faced another battle, getting the compensation they had been promised. Legal victories did not always translate into immediate financial relief. Bureaucratic delays, appeals from the convicted executives, and slow government processes meant that some families were still waiting for the support they desperately needed. Despite these struggles, many refused to stay silent. Some formed advocacy groups, pushing for stricter construction regulations and harsher penalties for companies that cut corners. Others worked with lawmakers to create new policies that would prevent another disaster. The tragedy had taken so much from them, but they were determined to turn their loss into something meaningful. A father who had lost his daughter in the collapse spoke at a public event. "Nothing can bring her back, but if speaking out stops this from happening again, then that's what I'll do for the rest of my life." His words echoed the feelings of many. Grief had turned into a fight for change. The collapse was more than just a tragic event. It became a case study in what happens when greed and negligence override responsibility. Investigators, journalists, and policymakers used this disaster as an example of why stricter enforcement of building regulations was necessary. In the months that followed, new laws were introduced, requiring more frequent inspections, harsher penalties for companies that ignored safety standards, and increased transparency in government contracts. Some of these policies were implemented, but doubts remained about whether they would be consistently enforced. Architects and engineers also took lessons from the case. Universities added the disaster to their curriculum, using it to teach future professionals about the real-world consequences of cost-cutting and corruption. Some companies began conducting internal audits, ensuring that their own projects met the highest safety standards to avoid a similar fate. But beyond legal and industry changes, the story left a lasting impact on ordinary people. Homebuyers and tenants became more cautious, demanding proof of structural integrity before moving into buildings. Whistleblowers in various industries felt encouraged to speak up, knowing that silence could lead to disaster. This tragedy was a warning, one that showed how ignoring safety, prioritizing profit over human lives, and trusting the wrong people could lead to devastating consequences. The question that remained was whether these lessons would be remembered or if, years down the line, history would repeat itself. The collapse was not just a tragic accident. It was the result of choices made by people who valued profit over safety. Every delay in inspection, every bribe exchanged for approval, every corner cut to save money had led to the loss of lives. This disaster was a painful reminder of what happens when responsibility is ignored. Holding those accountable was not just about punishment. It was about setting a precedent, making it clear that negligence would not go unnoticed. The case exposed weaknesses in the system, and while changes had been made, the real challenge was ensuring that they lasted. Laws could be written, regulations could be tightened, but without consistent enforcement, the cycle could continue. The tragedy left scars on the city, on the survivors, and on the families who had lost loved ones. But it also left a lesson. It showed the dangers of unchecked corruption and the price of ignoring warning signs. The hope was that this would serve as a turning point, a moment where the mistakes of the past led to a safer future. This case was not the first of its kind, and without vigilance, it would not be the last. The responsibility to prevent future disasters didn't just rest with governments or corporations, it also lay with ordinary people. Residents had the right to demand safe housing. Workers had the right to speak up about unsafe conditions without fear of retaliation. Consumers had the power to question the integrity of the structures they lived and worked in. Awareness was key. Reporting suspicious construction practices, questioning unusually low building costs, and supporting ethical businesses were all steps toward preventing another tragedy. Every time safety was prioritized over shortcuts, another disaster was potentially avoided. The disaster site had changed since the day of the collapse. The wreckage had been cleared, and in its place stood an empty lot. Flowers and photographs remained, left behind by those who still came to remember. The scars on the land mirrored the scars in the hearts of those affected.